Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. While making my video series comparing one-page rules and Games Workshop, I think it was the first video where I talked about cost, I mentioned that I wanted to make a video that was more specific and quantitatively comparing the real costs of building a model collection versus printing one versus buying a 3D printed one from somebody else. And I said one day I would do that.
What a coincidence! Because that's today.
So let's do a little list building, a little pricing, and let's see what we come up with. So in this video we're going to be comparing the cost of buying an army from Games Workshop, the cost of investing in a 3D printer and making them yourselves, and the cost of buying 3D prints from a third-party vendor. Now, when I first sat down to conduct this experiment, I decided to use a Necron list, and I did that for two reasons. First, the Necron are my primary army in 40K. They get special attention. My video, I get to pick. So, you know, it's just creator's choice there. But there is a more logical and relatable reason, and that's that one-page rules created a nearly one-to-one model copy for the Necron army. So I can do a very close comparison, model to model, sculpt to sculpt, and on top of that, One Page Rules has a designated third-party printing vendor. So we can do a very, very close analysis, building the same list, and not just finding any old model that compares, but actually comparing the two different model sets together and getting a fair comparison of pricing between Games Workshop, printing them yourselves, and buying them from the third-party vendor. So we're going to keep things fairly simple here. I drew up a simple 1,000 point army list, and I even started by using the Combat Patrol for the Necrons, since those box sets are bundles and therefore you're supposed to get a little bit of a deal on them, so giving a bit of an advantage to Games Workshop right from the start. Plus it's a good way to start building your army. Now, Games Workshop hasn't officially released the Combat Patrol for Necrons. I imagine they'll do that when they release the Codex later this year. But we know that all Combat Patrols are $160. And I remember when a Start Collecting box was under $100, but that's for a different video. Anyways, $160 for a Combat Patrol. And thanks to the downloadable rules for Necron Combat Patrol, we know exactly what's going to be in that Combat Patrol. So we have a price and we have an army list. So I used the Warhammer app, and the Combat Patrol comes out to about 500 points. So I used the Warhammer app to fill out the remaining 500 points. Now, obviously, we could already run into a bit of debate and discussion here about what units I should have put in this 1,000-point list. I could have stacked it with a few high-point models, which would have cut down on the number of models to buy and thus potentially skewed the amount to be printed and so on and so forth. That's true, that's reasonable, but that's a variable that I don't think I even want to try and control for right now. So what I did was I picked the remaining units for this 1,000-point list based on a few criteria. One, I wanted a mix of models. I wanted infantry, I wanted characters, I wanted vehicles. The other thing is I wanted to build the list to be flexible and thus have some utility in the game. So I'm not just going to build a list of entirely basic infantry. I wanted some things to be fast. I wanted some heavy support, some heavy firepower. I wanted at least one vehicle or mech. I wanted to mix it up. And then the reason why I added the death marks at the end was kind of a mix. I had 65 points left, and the death marks were the only unit in the Necron army that was exactly 65 points as stock. So that got me to the 1,000 point mark exactly. And the other thing is, I mean, they're snipers. What army doesn't want a good sniper? Yeah, we'll just move on. So what you end up with here then is a starter army that has a little bit of everything. I specifically stayed away from big stuff. No Void Dragon, no Monolith, because usually if you're just starting in the hobby, you're going to add those things later rather than sooner. And second, what kind of a person puts like a Void Dragon in a 1,000 point casual list? Okay, so there's our 1,000 points. And buying it from the Games Workshop website, it comes in at about $450. Now that by itself, as I mentioned in my video on cost, it might seem like a big initial buy-in to walk into a store and spend $450 on models, But remember, in comparison to, for example, buying an Xbox or a PlayStation, that's about the average cost of getting into a hobby. And if you compare it to like a gaming computer, buying a really good rig, that's a fraction of the cost. So at this point I can hear the next objection. Well, why don't I buy from a friendly local gaming store and get that 15% discount? Or why don't I just buy my stuff from eBay and get it much cheaper? Those are all valid points, but a few comments on it. First, I'm wanting to compare brand new with brand new. When you buy on eBay, you're typically buying used models. And in that case, now I'm comparing used resale price with brand new or newly printed ones. So that's not an entirely equal comparison. And yes, you can buy brand new stuff on eBay, but that leads me to my next point. When you buy from Games Workshop, print on your own, or buy pre-printed models, it means you're buying what you want rather than buying what you can get from the available stuff. Now, yes, occasionally the Games Workshop website runs out of something, but it usually comes back in. Whereas when you go on eBay, you just never know what's going to be there. You can't count on a particular model being up for sale, a particular kit being up for sale. You're kind of checking just to see what's available and get the good deals as they come. Whereas I wanted this to be comparing the ability to sit down, choose your models, and get exactly the models that you want. So the last point then is, what about the discount from the friendly local gaming stores? And that's an entirely fair point. So what I'm going to ask is we just put a little pin in that till the end of the experiment, and then let's take 15% off all of the costs, or at least the cost of Games Workshop, and we'll see what that does to the overall total. Okay, so we built our list, we bought it through GW. It was about $450 plus taxes and stuff. We're not going to worry about that. Now let's see what happens if we decide to invest in a 3D printer and print the models ourselves. So to start off, I budgeted about $300 for a resin printer. Printers are starting to get as diverse as cars in terms of quantity and pricing and quality and features and all that stuff. And $300 will get you a good 4K printer that has a decent sized build plate. You know, it's going to be able to print more than one model at a time, and it's big enough that it can print larger stuff like vehicles and dreadnoughts. You can definitely spend more or less depending on what kind of company you want to go with. You want to shrink down in size. I mean, there's a lot to work with here, so I kind of just went with the middle of the road. You can also wait for a big sale. Black Friday sales will come up during Thanksgiving, Christmas sales, where you can probably get a really good printer for even cheaper. But since that only happens once or twice a year, for the rest of the year, you're going to have to pay basically what they're asking, or again, wait for some kind of sale. So we'll stick with $300. I'm open to disagreement with that one, absolutely. Although I will put in a quick word before we move on here. I have an Elegoo Saturn, and I bought that printer about a year ago. It was right before the 4K printer started coming out. And for the price I paid for my printer, now I could get a decent 4K printer, a smaller 8K printer, as well as a wash and a curing station. So in just 1 year, printers have gotten much better as they've gotten cheaper. It's kind of like computers. So the other thing about this whole comparison is it's going to be obsolete the longer this video is up. But anyways, so I wanted to just mention that prices continue to go down as quality continues to go up. So we're stick with the $300. I know that's open to debate. I didn't include a wash and curing station though, because those aren't absolutely necessary. You can wash in an old bucket, you can cure using daylight or an old UV lamp or something like that. Yes, if you get serious into 3D printing, you will buy them. But for a brand new hobbyist, I imagine it's one of those things they're going to buy the printer and test it out and see if they want to get into that. Then they'll buy the wash and curing station rather than getting it all at once. Now, after the printer, you're going to need several bottles of resin. And depending on what quality and type of resin you get, the cost can range quite a bit, as I've mentioned in a previous video. So for this one, I budgeted about 2 to 3 bottles of the 1,000 gram bottles of resin. So that's the cost that we're going to go with here. You're also going to need a fair amount of alcohol. A little bit will work for washing a few models, but we're going to be washing and printing an entire army. So I put in about a gallon, which is $30 from Amazon. The last thing is we need something to print. So you can buy the entire range of Robot Legion STLs for $194. So Robot Legions, that's the one-page rules equivalent of the Necron. And now we can print the exact same army that we put together in the Games Workshop shopping cart using OPR models, and the whole cost of everything for the printer, the resin, the alcohol, the STLs, $604. So GW is definitely the cheaper option by about $150 initially. And then you still have to buy the, you have to print, you have to work with the resin, you have to clean it. There is a learning curve with 3D printing, whereas there's not nearly as much of a learning curve with learning to build, get some clippers and glue. So if that part sounds unappealing, we still have one more option to look at here. GW hasn't won just yet, although it has a clear advantage. Let's see what happens if you get someone else to print your minis using OPR's STL files. So the website Only Games prints all of the STL files that One Page Rules produces. So it's important here to show a model for model comparison so that we can see we're comparing apples to apples, and that I'm not subbing in a tiny tank and saying it's a Baneblade and look how much cheaper it is. So as you can see, as the pictures are popping up here, the sculpts, they're not identical, but the models are intended to be similar, not just as a proxy. The names are even very similar because the intention was you can take your Necron army and port it over entirely into One Page Rules. And once we buy this army through Only Games, the grand total price for that same army, $357. Now, it's a bit of a flip here. Why is it so cheap? Well, the character models are only $10. When Games Workshop makes a character model, usually they're $30, $35. They're starting to get very expensive. And as far as buying the larger units, like the warriors and things, that's about the same cost. Buying 20 warriors from Only Games was about the same as buying 2 boxes of Games Workshop warriors. It'll be a bit more for the 3D printing ones because you have to buy the Scarab Swarms in addition, whereas those come with the warriors from Games Workshop. But the reason for this big price difference is that the printer is just charging you for the resin, and it prints on demand. It's whether they sell 1, whether they sell 1,000,000, it doesn't matter. It's the same cost to them. Whereas Games Workshop knows that every Necron player is only going to need 1 of each type of named character, maybe 2 of the non-named characters, and so they raise the price to offset the volume of sales. So that's how we end up with this very dramatic difference in price points on things like characters. So when we get down to it, buying them from Games Workshop, the army cost $450. Printing it ourselves, $604. And then buying pre-printed, $357. So at a small army level, you're actually doing better paying someone else to print the models than going to Games Workshop or getting into printing. And when you're ready to buy bigger stuff, that price actually holds pretty well. For example, a Necron Monolith is a $185 kit, while the Robot Fortress pre-printed from Only Games is $167. So it's still a little bit cheaper. And even when you get to the really big models, the pre-printed stuff starts to look more like Forge World, but still coming in a little bit cheaper. For example, one of the most expensive things you can buy on Only Games is the Jackal Mastodon, and that thing is $345 to buy that kit. But if you head on over to Forge World and try and buy something of equal size, my guess is it's even more. So there's our initial comparison. And just to give a second data point, maybe not as thorough, but still, more data is good. I did another quick check with a Space Marine army, since Space Marines are more widely popular than Necron. So here is a 1,000 point list of Space Marines, again starting with the Combat Patrol and building up from there using the same guidelines that I had for the Necron. Now One Page Rules doesn't have STLs for their Battle Brother army. So instead, I looked around on My Mini Factory for some Space Marine equivalents, and I didn't spend too long. I didn't want to spend the whole evening doing it, but after a few minutes I found these. So okay, they're definitely leaning towards Dark Angels, but I imagine with a little bit of searching you could find similar STLs for whatever chapter it is you're looking for. So now how does this cost compare to that of the Space Marine army? Again, Games Workshop is cheaper than printing them yourself. And since there isn't a pre-existing company that I know of that just has all of these printing, these Space Marines to be printed for you. You could find someone on Etsy to do it, but I consider that a special commission rather than a designated vendor like Only Games. So you're probably going to pay a bit more of a premium. But here's the little secret to all of this price comparison. Games Workshop has actually come off getting second place in this comparison for a 1,000 point army. But what if we scale it up? What if we want a 2,000 point army? What if we decide we want 1,000 points of a different army? For Games Workshop, that will be another $400 in models, possibly even more. But if we want to, for example, let's go with the scaling up. Let's say we want 2,000 points now. That's going to be another $450. We're now at $900 from Games Workshop. But when we bought that STL bundle for the Robot Legions, we got all of them. And if you were to join One Page Rules Patreon for $120 a year, you get every STL they create starting from the month that you join. So it's a subscription service. Endless STLs for a set price. It's the Netflix of 3D printing. And since you already have the printer, that next 1,000 points of models will cost you about $100 in resin and alcohol. And if you want new STLs, let's say you want to expand to a different aesthetic, that will cost you maybe another $50 or $100 to buy those files. So now you're looking at your next 1,000 points costing you between $150 and $200 instead of $400 to $450. And this grows exponentially. By the time we get to, say, our third 2,000 point army, because everyone knows once you start down the tabletop wargaming rabbit hole, you never stop. Everyone's going to end up with their third 2,000 point army, given enough time. When we get to that point, we will have spent almost $3,000 on Games Workshop models, but less than $1,000 for printing it ourselves, and probably somewhere around $1,500 if we were to keep paying a third-party vendor to do it for us. Even when we add in that 15% discount at a friendly local gaming store, doing the math really quick, that's about $450 if I'm doing it right, off of $3,000. So yeah, after you've spent $3,000, you've gotten an army for free. But even with that 15%, you're still nowhere near what you saved by printing it yourself. So I can hear some of the other objections popping up right now. For example, now that you've seen the Robot Legion models from One Page Rules, you might say, those aren't as nice. And I can definitely accept that. Those Robot Legion sculpts are some of the earliest sculpts that One Page Rules did. And they're actually starting to go back through and redo some of their models. They're updating them, they're making them more detailed, they're improving them since they now have a little bit more money and they can hire more artists and put more effort into it. But I can totally understand the argument that you just don't like the way the OPR models look. And in that case, it's totally acceptable. You're paying more money for something you want more. That's no problem. That's making a conscious decision to pay for certain features. But I've also seen, and as I pointed out in a previous video, STL files are getting better and better. More people are coming up with new ideas, new aesthetics, new looks for models and things. And so even if you don't like the One Page Rules models, I'll bet with some searching you can find something that's just as good, if not better, than the look you're getting from Games Workshop, and you're still paying $10 for the files to print a squad of 5 guys, or $20 or $30 for the STL file to print a vehicle. So you're still getting what you want, but at a fraction of the cost. The only hurdle, as I mentioned previously, is this initial investment and the learning curve. And so if those are the two things that are really keeping you out of it, you can probably find someone at your local gaming store who has a printer and is willing to print whatever you're looking for a price. And at that point, you'll probably come in a little bit under GW anyways, depending how much they charge you. But that's up to you to haggle with the individual. So there it is. Let me know what you think. Are you considering getting a 3D printer and getting into that side of the hobby? Are you going to just stick with buying pre-existing stuff, maybe not just from Games Workshop, but from other miniature creators because you don't want to fiddle with the whole 3D printing thing? Are you happy buying them 3D printed from somebody else? Who knows? Let me know. I'm curious. I'm certain that 3D printing is not the cure-all for the costs of tabletop wargaming, but as I think we've shown today, it's good enough.